The sophistication of the legal representation for these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. Think about this. In 1750, a female donkey was tried for bestiality along with her human co-defendant in France. The donkey's defense attorney successfully argued that she was an unwilling victim, and the donkey was acquitted, while the man was executed. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's previous good character and moral behavior. Can you imagine standing in court and saying, "Your Honor, this donkey has a spotless record, never done a thing wrong in its life"? That must say something about the donkey's personality, right? But animals weren't the only surprising defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects, things without life, could also be put on trial. If a sword was used to kill someone, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells that rang during violent storms were sometimes put on trial for their role in summoning destructive weather. And trees that fell and killed passers-by could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be chopped down and removed. These trials of inanimate objects reflected a worldview where the lines between the animate and the inanimate, the moral and the amoral, were far blurrier than our modern understanding. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order, and when that order was disrupted, the law would step in to restore balance. To us today, suing a tree sounds ridiculous, but try to put yourself in the shoes of a medieval peasant who had just lost a family member to a falling tree. To them, it wasn't just a random accident, but a disruption of divine order, requiring a formal response to appease what had been upset. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these trials weren't mere curiosities. They were serious manifestations of a worldview that genuinely believed in God's direct intervention in daily life. If a tree fell and killed someone, it wasn't due to the wind, it was an act of divine will, and that will had to be interpreted and dealt with. It's like a horror movie where the object isn't just an object, but a sentient being with a will of its own. Except in this case, it might end up in court. The idea of a sword being banished from the realm might seem like an odd punishment for an inanimate object, but it spoke to something deeper about how they perceived the world. It wasn't just about removing a dangerous item. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to cleanse the area of the object's sin. It's like how you might throw out an old computer that's not working, but they'd have a grand ceremony to exorcise it. One of the more astonishing aspects of these inanimate object trials is how they highlight the era's lack of scientific understanding. They had no concept of gravity or weather or disease in the way we understand them. So when something terrible happened, there had to be an explanation and a culprit. If it wasn't human, then it had to be something else. And that's how these innocent objects and animals found themselves held accountable. Imagine a trial where a knife is accused of murder. The defense attorney might argue that the knife was merely a tool, and the fault lay in the hand that wielded it. But for the medieval mind, the knife itself might be considered accursed or possessing some malevolent essence. This shows that they had a very different relationship with the material world than we do. For them, everything had a spirit or an intention of some kind. Sounds a bit like an episode of The Twilight Zone, doesn't it? But it was their reality. The cases of church bells being tried for causing storms are another excellent example. Bells, for many, were sacred objects, ones capable of summoning or warding off supernatural forces. So if a terrible storm struck and the church bells had been ringing, there might be a connection. It's like blaming your toaster for burning your toast, but they'd actually take the toaster to court. These trials of inanimate objects, along with the animal trials, provide us with a unique insight into the worldview of the Middle Ages. They show a society where belief in the divine, in moral order, and in God's intervention was central to everything. We might find them bizarre or irrational, but for them, they were serious mechanisms for maintaining order in a world they believed was constantly under threat from unseen forces. Following the peculiar cases of animals and inanimate objects, the concept of ordeal by God further amplified the strangeness of medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would not permit an innocent person to suffer harm in these trials, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Can you imagine a justice system where you had to trust in a miracle to be proven innocent? That's a level of faith in the supernatural that we, modern folk, can barely grasp. The ordeal by hot iron was one such trial. The accused would be required to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a specified distance, often 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or resisted healing, guilt was presumed. Sounds fair, right? Sure, nothing wrong with just holding a scorching piece of metal and hoping for the best. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this was probably not the best way to treat a burn, guilty or innocent. Perhaps they just didn't have enough aloe vera back then. The ordeal by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, they were deemed guilty, as the pure water was thought to be rejecting them. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent posthumously. This presented what we might call a significant design flaw in the justice system. Innocence could only be proven through death. Can you imagine the verdict being delivered? You are innocent, but unfortunately, you've drowned. A small comfort, isn't it? It's like winning the lottery, but then finding out you can't collect the money. Perhaps most dramatic, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through physical battle. This could involve the disputing parties actually fighting each other, or they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous side. Interestingly, this practice wasn't limited to men. Women, clergy, and the elderly could all demand trial by combat, though they were far more likely to hire champions than to fight themselves. Can you imagine an elderly nun hiring a muscular gladiator to settle her dispute? My place is to wield the crozier, not the sword. Trial by combat wasn't just a way to settle legal disputes. It was a public spectacle, an entertainment in a way. Towns and villages would gather to witness these battles, believing they were watching direct divine intervention. It was like a medieval reality TV show, but with actual consequences and no audience voting. Can you imagine a friend saying, "Are you coming to watch the fight tonight? I hear the blacksmith is fighting the baker. This one's going to be a real showdown." The concept of ordeals by God was deeply embedded in the religious and supernatural beliefs of the Middle Ages. It was believed that God was an active and just judge who would never allow an innocent person to be condemned. This provided a certain level of reassurance to a society that was constantly facing plagues, wars, and famine. If you could survive an ordeal, you had certainly received divine favor. If not, well, at least you found your innocence in the afterlife. A lesser-known aspect of ordeals was that they didn't always result in death. Sometimes the punishment was simply intense pain, a lingering wound to serve as a reminder of their guilt. The ordeal by boiling water was another example. The accused would have to plunge their hand into boiling water and then be examined 3 days later. Again, the healing of the wound would determine guilt or innocence. These procedures might seem barbaric and irrational to us today. Yet, within the medieval context, where legal evidence was often scarce and forensic science non-existent, they were seen as legitimate ways to ascertain the truth. It was believed that God's will would be revealed, and that is all that truly mattered. It's like playing a game where the rule is, you have to win or you're going to be in pain. And of course, there was always the possibility you might just die. We can feel a sense of relief living in an age where trials are decided by evidence and reason rather than a red-hot iron or a fight to the death. However, it's important to understand that these peculiar laws weren't born of mere ignorance. They were serious, albeit brutal attempts to find justice and maintain order in a world very different from our own. As we conclude this segment, allow this idea of supernatural justice to gently settle in your mind and prepare for even stranger discoveries about medieval law. Moving on from the bizarre occupations, the legal status of different professions in medieval Europe also created some surprisingly peculiar laws. We're talking about rules that didn't involve whether you were guilty or innocent, but rather who you were and what you did for a living. Sounds familiar, right? But hold on. This went far beyond what you might imagine. Take the example of executioners. Their position in medieval society was truly strange. While their services were essential to the functioning of the justice system, after all, someone had to do the dirty work, they were often considered ritually unclean and subject to numerous restrictions. Can you imagine a profession that was both indispensable and so socially shunned that you couldn't even touch other people's food? In many German states, executioners were required to live outside the city walls and could only enter the town to perform their duties. They were forbidden from touching food at markets, as it was believed their contact would contaminate the goods. Can you picture yourself walking through the market and seeing a butcher screaming, "Don't touch my pork, you executioner!" That wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a mark of deep social ostracism. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented their income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their extensive knowledge of anatomy, gained through their primary profession, made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created a paradoxical situation where the same person could take a life in the morning and save one in the afternoon. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this was definitely not a job for the faint of heart. Can you imagine a shingle for a medical practice that read, "Executioner and physician, specialists in healing," or ending it? Such peculiar laws also extended to other professions. For instance, entertainers, like actors or musicians, often had a low legal status, sometimes being considered morally questionable. They might be restricted from living in certain areas and forbidden from participating in public office. It was like a medieval version of being relegated to the kids' table. Consider matchmakers or those involved in professions society deemed dubious. They too could be subject to specific restrictions reflecting the moral and social values of the time. This shows that medieval laws weren't just about crime and punishment. They were also about maintaining a strict social order where everyone had a defined place, and some places were more desirable than others. The sheer oddity of these laws might make you chuckle, but they also say something profound about how societies organize themselves. In a world where status and honor were everything, even your profession could significantly shape your legal rights and limitations. It wasn't about your competence. It was about how you fit into the grand picture and whether you fit their notion of cleanliness. Think about those in financial professions, like moneylenders. While essential to the economy, they were often socially stigmatized and could be subject to harsh laws, especially if they were Jewish, who were often pushed into this profession due to other restrictions. This shows another layer of complexity in the web of medieval laws. They often reflected social and religious prejudices more than just pure justice. And then there were professions that we today might find completely innocuous, but which had specific rules in the Middle Ages. For instance, those who worked with dead animals or who were in the butchering trade might also be subject to stigma or restrictions due to the unclean nature of their work. It's like having to apply for a special permit just to exist. In sum, medieval laws concerning professions offer a fascinating glimpse into the intricate layers of society during that era. We're not just talking about crimes and punishments, we're talking about complex systems of status, ritual, and social ostracism coded into law. It was a world where your professional identity could influence where you lived, who you could interact with, and even how you were buried. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Yeah, these laws weren't something you'd want to take home.
Following the woes of professions, medieval laws concerning debt produced some particularly creative solutions. In our modern societies, we have bankruptcy proceedings, collection agencies, and sometimes a few annoying phone calls. But the Middle Ages, they had a whole different approach to unpaid debts, one that would certainly make you think twice before taking out a loan for a new cart. In some parts of medieval France, a debtor who couldn't pay might be required to sit naked in the town square, shouting out their shame for all passers-by to witness. This public humiliation was designed both to punish and to encourage charitable contributions from onlookers. Can you imagine walking through the market and seeing that sight? Oh, look, there's old Jack, the fellow I lent money to for that goat. He doesn't look so good. That would certainly make you think twice before forgetting to pay your utility bill. But wait, it gets even stranger. Some regions developed the concept of inherited debt in ways that seem almost surreal to us today. In parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor's children, but only if they were present when the debt was incurred. This led to the bizarre practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to shield them from future liability. Can you imagine a family meeting? Absolutely do not bring Timmy into this room. We're talking about buying a new cow and we don't want him to be liable for that debt in 50 years. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this created some very awkward family situations. Imagine being a child and your friends ask, "Why don't you ever get to sit in on your family's business meetings?" And you have to reply, "Oh, that's because my parents are afraid if I hear them buy a new hoe, I'll be on the hook for it later." The medieval legal system wasn't simply about recovering money. It was about maintaining social order and punishing what was seen as a moral failing. Failing to repay a debt wasn't just a financial matter. It was a breach of trust, a stain on one's honor. And public humiliation was considered an effective way to restore that balance. Beyond public shaming, debtors could also face indentured servitude. This meant that they would be forced to work for their creditor until the debt was repaid, sometimes for life. It was a form of forced labor, and it bound many peasants into a cycle of inescapable debt. It's like if you had credit card debt, but instead of just paying interest, you had to go weed the credit card company's garden for 20 years. Consider the peasants who were bound to the land. They owed their lords through labor and taxes. If they couldn't fulfill their obligations, the punishment could be severe, ranging from flogging to the confiscation of their meager landholdings. It was a system where scarcity and power created a web of obligations and penalties. A lesser-known twist was the concept of the debt pawn. This involved a person pawning themselves or a family member into servitude to repay a debt. While not as common as other forms of punishment, it was still a terrifying option for those in the direst of straits. It's a grim reminder of the lengths that people would go to escape the burden of debt. As we ponder these laws, you might wonder, were there any protections for the debtor? Well, not as many as we have today. The concept of a safety net was almost non-existent. If you couldn't pay, you were in serious trouble. And as you can see, that trouble could extend for a lifetime and even be passed down to your children. The medieval laws of debt are a vivid reminder of a world where concepts of individual rights and social protection were vastly different from today. They illustrate a society that prioritized order and accountability, even if it meant imposing brutal and humiliating penalties. Allowed the idea of shaming town squares and family meetings without children to gently settle in your mind as we move on to the next segment of our historical journey.
Following the woes of debt, medieval laws concerning markets and trade created their own category of unusual legislation. In our modern world, we have quality standards, regulatory agencies, and occasionally a class action lawsuit. But the Middle Ages? They had a different approach, often involving public shaming and a healthy dose of poetic justice. In medieval London, the punishment for selling substandard food was often poetic justice taken to an extreme. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a cart with the offending loaf tied around their neck. Can you imagine yourself shopping in the market and seeing that sight? Oh, look, there's Baker John. He seems to be having another bad day. That would certainly make you think twice before trying to pass off a slightly smaller loaf. Brewers who watered down their ale might be forced to drink their own diluted product for a specified period. Just think, you're convicted of selling weak ale, and the punishment is you have to drink that terrible ale yourself. Good morning, Frank. I hear you're on a diet of your own beer all day. What a heinous crime. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this was probably a pretty effective deterrent. Who would want to drink their own watered-down brew? These laws weren't just about punishing fraud, they were about protecting the community and maintaining trust in the local marketplace. In a world without nutritional labels or ingredient lists, consumers were entirely dependent on the word of the vendors they bought from. So, the punishment had to be public and memorable to ensure everyone understood that cheating would not be tolerated. Consider the butchers. If they were found to be selling spoiled or diseased meat, they could face severe penalties, including being dragged through the streets with the rotting meat displayed. The smell alone would have been a powerful reminder to everyone. This wasn't just about being fined, it was about losing your reputation, which in a small medieval community could be far worse than a spell in jail. The laws also regulated other commodities such as cloth and garments. Weavers and tailors found to be using inferior materials or mixing in cheaper fabrics could face similar public humiliations. Their faulty product might be put on display in the marketplace, or they might be forced to wear it. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Yeah, this seems a little worse. A lesser-known point was the oversight by guilds. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants, and they often had their own internal laws and regulations to govern their members. If a guild member cheated, they faced not only the town's law, but also the wrath of their guild, which could lead to expulsion and loss of livelihood. Medieval market regulation is an excellent example of how societies adapted to the challenges of the time. With limited resources and the absence of strong governmental regulatory bodies, communities had to rely on public shaming and memorable punishments to maintain order and ensure fair trade practices. These laws speak to a world where the sense of community was very strong and where trust in a neighbor or a tradesperson was paramount. If that trust was broken, there were serious and highly public consequences. It wasn't just about doing business, it was about being a trustworthy member of the community. So, as you stroll through a modern market filled with endless choices and assurances of quality, take a moment to reflect on our medieval predecessors. They didn't have access to online reviews or consumer protection agencies. Instead, they had bakers being dragged through the streets and brewers forced to drink their own terrible product. These peculiar laws aren't just humorous anecdotes. They're windows into a world where ingenuity and justice were sometimes combined in the most astonishing and memorable ways. Allow these images to gently settle in your mind as we move on to the next mysteries of medieval law. Moving on from the strange notions of property rights, medieval laws concerning buried treasure also generated some fascinating legal concepts. In our world, you find something, you keep it, or you locate its rightful owner. But the Middle Ages? They had a different approach, sometimes involving debates about whether a treasure was buried or merely hidden. The doctrine of treasure trove dictated that any valuable items found buried in the ground belonged to the crown, based on the assumption that they had been deliberately hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found lying on the surface, it belonged to the finder, leading to complex legal arguments about what exactly constituted buried versus hidden. Can you imagine a medieval lawyer arguing whether a gold goblet was buried if it was just under a thin layer of leaves? Your Honor, this is clearly a case of sunbathing, not burial. The goblet was merely enjoying a tan.
Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these debates could get quite heated, especially when substantial wealth was involved. Rules and precedents had to be created to avoid chaos, and these treasure laws were a perfect example of that. Beyond treasure, laws also regulated other aspects of property ownership, such as the use and inheritance of land. The concept of feudal rights governed everything, with land ownership tiered in a hierarchy from the king down to the peasants. A peasant might use the land, but the ultimate ownership belonged to their lord. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this was a little more complex than just putting on lotion. This led to intricate disputes over rights, obligations, and duties. A lord might have rights to the trees on your land or to the water in your well. It wasn't just about who owned what. It was about a complex web of overlapping rights and responsibilities, often leading to conflict. Consider the laws surrounding common property. Villages and communities often had areas of common land, such as pastures or forests, where everyone had rights of usage. However, the use of these common resources was often governed by customary laws and could lead to disputes if one party felt they were being deprived. Sounds a bit like a medieval homeowners association meeting, doesn't it? The Browns are putting too many sheep on the common pasture, and it's causing problems for my goats. A lesser-known example of property rights involved the rights to wild animals. In many regions, all wild game, particularly deer and boars, belonged to the king or the local lord. This meant that a peasant could not hunt wild animals on their own land without permission, and violating these laws could lead to severe penalties. It was another way the aristocracy maintained control over resources and kept the peasants in their place. In summary, medieval property rights were not a simple matter as we might have today. They were a complex web of customary laws, feudal rights, and metaphysical notions of ownership. Whether it was about a buried hoard of gold or the right to graze your goats on a common field, medieval laws attempted to maintain order in a world where resources were scarce and power was hierarchical. As we delve into these peculiar laws, you might find that they are not merely historical curiosities. They are windows into a world where notions of ownership were vastly different from what we take for granted today. Allow the idea of buried treasure and debates over whether a goblet was sunbathing to gently settle in your mind as we move on to the next section.
Following our exploration of peculiar property rights, we now turn to the question, why were all these laws so strange? They weren't just products of backward thinking or rudimentary legal understanding. On the contrary, they reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order in a world vastly different from our own. You might be asking yourself, how did suing a pig even make sense? Well, that's where we have to step back and look at the larger context. Medieval society faced challenges we can barely imagine: constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic instability, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the fragile balance that held communities together. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that when you're facing mass extinction, you do whatever you can to keep things from completely falling apart. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. What seems bizarre to us was perfectly logical to people living in a world where divine judgment was an everyday reality, where communal harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be seen and felt by every member of society. Consider the deep belief in divine intervention. For the medieval person, God wasn't a distant entity. He was an active player in daily life. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a breach of divine order. By bringing the pig to trial and executing it, they weren't just punishing the animal, they were restoring the cosmic balance that had been upset.
Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this was a far more elaborate way of trying to control an unpredictable world. Furthermore, in a world without modern police forces or complex court systems, laws often served as public forms of education and deterrence. When a baker was dragged through the streets with an underweight loaf around his neck, it wasn't just a punishment for him, it was a warning to everyone else in the marketplace. It was like a public service announcement, but with a far higher degree of public shaming. And then there was the element of community reconciliation. In small, tightly knit societies, maintaining peace and consensus was paramount. A murder, a theft, or even an unpaid debt could cause rifts within the community. The strange laws, with their ritualistic and public nature, provided a means of resolving these disputes and restoring harmony. Even a trial by combat could be seen as a way to restore honor and bring an end to a dispute, no matter how brutal the outcome. A lesser-known point was the role of laws in solidifying the power of rulers. By creating and enforcing these laws, lords and kings reinforced their authority and asserted their control over the populace. Handing down bizarre but impactful judgments or maintaining ancient traditions like ordeals by God solidified their image as guardians of divine order and justice. In summary, the strangeness of medieval laws wasn't a sign of incompetence, but rather a testament to human adaptability. They were threads in a complex tapestry of beliefs, traditions, and practical necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about an entire way of understanding the world, human nature, and our place within the grand scheme of creation. As we conclude this segment, allow this thought to gently settle in your mind. While we might find these laws astonishing, they served a vital purpose in maintaining a fragile world. Allow these questions to gently lull you to sleep.
Moving on from the intricate and often peculiar medieval laws, we now transition to a fundamental and often harsh aspect of life: food. While kings and nobles feasted on lavish banquets, complete with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of the population lived on the brink of starvation. Their meals consisted of little more than coarse bread and watery porridge. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth. It was a reflection of an entire social system built upon inequality. Can you imagine a world where the best meal you ever had was a bland vegetable gruel? For the average peasant, meat was a particular luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and occasionally a young animal that could be sold for cash. When meat did appear on a peasant's table, it was often during religious festivals or when an animal had grown too old or sick for other purposes. Even then, every scrap was utilized, from offal to blood sausage, as nothing could be wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that they made the most of every part of the animal, from nose to tail, and then some. Food preservation posed another enormous challenge. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, laden with impurities that could make cured meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish was packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, try imagining the smell of spoiled salted fish in a home with no ventilation. But perhaps the most insidious problem was the rampant adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven by poverty and desperation, routinely cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, a staple of the medieval diet, was frequently mixed with sawdust, chalk, ground corn, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were regularly watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable beverages that offered little in the way of refreshment or nutrition. Can you imagine taking a sip of your beer and wondering if you're drinking a little bit of chalkboard dust? The story of Agnes, a fictional but representative alewife, perfectly illustrates these challenges. Struggling to feed her family after her husband's death, Agnes faced rising grain prices and dwindling customers. Desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits, she began to water down her brew. At first, the deception went unnoticed, but rumors quickly spread about the weak, flavorless ale. Her loyal customers began to seek out other establishments, and Agnes's reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in an even more desperate situation. It was a vicious cycle of desperation, where you had to cheat to survive, but that cheating ultimately ruined you. Authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves tied around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective, as the underlying economic pressures that led people to adulterate their products remained unchanged. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, where you never quite knew if the food you were buying was truly what it seemed.
Beyond the issues of adulterated food, the lack of dietary diversity in the medieval diet was another source of hardship. While we today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from across the globe year-round, medieval people were entirely dependent on what could be grown locally and what was in season. For much of the year, peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, supplemented by whatever vegetables they could cultivate in their small gardens. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were among the hardiest crops, but they offered little in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. Can you imagine eating the exact same thing every single day for an entire year? Sounds like a diet no one would want to stick to. The seasonality of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult times. By then, the previous year's harvest had been depleted, and new crops had yet to mature. This period, known as the Hungry Gap, was when malnutrition was most severe and mortality rates highest. Children born during these lean months were often stunted and had weakened immune systems, affecting them for the rest of their lives. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this was definitely not an ideal time to be born. Perhaps that's why everyone looked so grumpy in medieval paintings. Spices, which we take for granted today, were among the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had to be transported vast distances along perilous trade routes, making them incredibly expensive. A pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could cost the equivalent of 7 oxen, putting it far out of reach for the common person. For the wealthy, spices were not merely flavor enhancers, but also symbols of status and power, displayed prominently like jewels or fine clothing. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this was a completely different kind of luxury, and it smelled a lot better. The contrast between rich and poor was perhaps nowhere more apparent than in the royal banquet. These lavish affairs were designed not just to feed the nobility, but to showcase their immense wealth and power. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, swans, and other exotic birds, which were meticulously refeathered after cooking to create stunning visual displays. Sugar sculptures called subtleties depicted scenes from mythology or heraldic symbols, while servants paraded dishes through the hall with ceremonial pomp. Yet even these magnificent feasts held their own dangers. Without an understanding of food safety, Even the wealthy were susceptible to food poisoning and other illnesses. The death of King John of England in 1216, reportedly from eating tainted peaches, was a reminder that, in the medieval world, every meal held the potential for peril. The king was traveling through the countryside when he stopped at an abbey and enjoyed what he thought was a harmless meal. Within days, he was dead from what modern historians believe was severe food poisoning. It was a grim reminder that even royalty were not immune to the risks of medieval food. The unsanitary conditions of medieval life further exacerbated these food safety issues. Peasant families often shared their single-room homes with livestock, as animals provided warmth during the cold winter months. However, this arrangement meant that animal waste, insects, and rodents were ever present in the dwelling. Food was prepared and consumed in these same spaces, with contamination almost unavoidable. In medieval towns and cities, the situation was even worse. Narrow, winding streets teemed with refuse, human waste, and effluvia from various trades and industries. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that waste often contaminated water sources, making even drinking water a hazardous proposition. For example, the River Thames in London served as both the city's primary water source and its main sewer system, a situation that contributed to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases.
Beyond the environmental hygiene issues, the Catholic Church added another layer of complexity to medieval food culture through its extensive fasting requirements. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, adherents were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant substituting with fish and other options, but for the poor, it often meant simply going without. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also designated as meat-free days throughout the year, further restricting an already limited diet. While the Church's intent may have been spiritual, the practical impact of these restrictions was often to exacerbate the nutritional plight of an already undernourished population. Can you imagine trying to go on a diet when you barely have enough to eat?
Following the Church's efforts, both sacred and practical, in shaping food culture, we cannot ignore one of the darkest chapters in medieval food history, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. This was not merely a single crop failure, it was a catastrophic confluence of climate change, successive harvest failures, and political instability that plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and suffering. Contemporary chroniclers paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. Can you imagine a famine that lasted for 7 years? That's like a continuous diet for long enough to watch all the seasons of your favorite long-running TV show, but in real life and with no snacks. The Flemish chronicler William of Nangus wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to cannibalism in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared. In parts of the Low Countries and Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these numbers were definitely understated. The situation had to be far worse. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical, creating a generation haunted by memories of extreme hunger and loss. Even in normal times, the threat of food scarcity was never far away. A single crop failure could spell disaster for an entire community, and peasant families lived in constant fear of the next crisis. This precarious existence shaped every aspect of medieval life, from marriage and family planning to religious beliefs and social structures. People developed intricate strategies for coping with scarcity, from elaborate systems of mutual aid to detailed knowledge of wild plants and alternative food sources. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this was a much bigger problem, and no sunscreen could help you. The contrast between medieval food culture and our modern abundance is striking. Today, we can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from across the globe, all neatly packaged and ready for consumption. We have access to an unimaginable variety of foods that even the wealthiest medieval nobles could not have conceived. Our understanding of nutrition, food safety, and preservation has transformed eating from a daily struggle into a source of pleasure and nourishment. However, this abundance also comes with its own challenges. We grapple with issues of food waste, environmental sustainability, and diet-related health problems that were unknown in the medieval world. The global food system that provides us with such variety also creates new forms of inequality and ecological degradation. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors about the value of eating locally and seasonally, and the importance of not taking food for granted. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? As if we're repeating history just with refrigerators and delivery trucks. The story of medieval food is ultimately one of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of immense challenges. Despite the constant threats of hunger, disease, and adulteration, people found ways to survive and even to create moments of joy and celebration around food. They developed preservation techniques still used today, crafted dishes that evolved into modern cuisines, and established traditions of hospitality and sharing that continue to shape our culture. As we reflect on this distant past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we have made and the privileges we enjoy. The simple act of opening a refrigerator or visiting a grocery store represents centuries of advancements in agriculture, technology, and social organization. At the same time, the medieval experience reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food and the importance of ensuring that everyone has access to adequate nourishment.
The legacy of medieval food culture persists in various ways. Traditional preservation methods like smoking and fermentation have made a strong comeback among modern chefs seeking authentic flavors and sustainable practices. The seasonal rhythms that once dictated the medieval diet are being rediscovered by proponents of local and sustainable agriculture. Even the lavish feasts of the nobility have their modern counterparts in fine dining establishments that transform meals into theatrical experiences. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience teaches us about the profound connection between food, community, and survival. In a world where starvation was a constant threat, sharing food became one of the most fundamental expressions of human compassion and solidarity. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this is a much deeper kind of life lesson. As we drift to sleep in our modern world of abundance, we can remember the countless generations who struggled to fill their bellies with whatever meager sustenance they could find. Their perseverance in the face of such adversity reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of gratitude for the simple blessings we often take for granted. In honoring their memory, we commit to building a world where no one needs to endure the pangs of hunger that shaped so much of human history.
Poor sanitary conditions made every meal a potential hazard. Peasant families shared their cramped dwellings with livestock, creating breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Animal waste commingled with food preparation areas, while flies and rodents spread filth throughout living spaces. Even royalty was not immune. The death of King John of England in 1216, purportedly from eating spoiled peaches, demonstrates how contaminated food could fell rulers as easily as peasants. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this seems a little worse than just getting a sunburn. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 laid bare the precarious nature of medieval food security. 7 successive years of crop failures plunged Europe into such severe starvation that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people resorting to eating grass, bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25% in some regions, with cities like Erfurt averaging 16 deaths per day compared to 2 in normal times. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these figures were definitely understated. The situation had to be far worse. Despite these immense challenges, medieval people displayed incredible resilience and ingenuity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Women, who were primarily responsible for feeding their families, created folk traditions of pickling and foraging that sustained communities through lean times. Monasteries served as centers of agricultural innovation and charitable food distribution, providing some relief to the desperate. The rare royal banquet offered a stunning contrast to daily reality. Royal feasts featured dozens of elaborate courses, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies seasoned with precious spices. These extravagant culinary displays were not merely entertainment, but potent demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast chasm between the privileged few and the struggling many. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people found ways to create meaning and community around food despite its scarcity. Harvest festivals brought villages together in celebration of abundant crops. Weddings, no matter how humble, marked life's milestones with shared meals. Even the simplest stew became an opportunity for families to gather around the hearth, share stories, and reinforce the bonds that sustained them through hardship. The legacy of medieval food culture reminds us of both human fragility and resilience. In an age where we access flavors from across the globe with unprecedented ease and safety, it is worth remembering those who found joy and sustenance in the simplest of meals. Their struggles and ingenuity laid the groundwork for the abundance we now enjoy, teaching us never to take for granted the fundamental human right to nourishment and the profound satisfaction of sharing food with those we love. As we drift to sleep with full stomachs and myriad choices at our fingertips, we can honor their memory by cherishing the incredible journey that has brought us from medieval scarcity to modern abundance. In every bite, we taste the hard-won progress of countless generations who turned necessity into culinary art, ensuring future generations could know plenty where they only knew want.
Having pondered the ingenuity of medieval people in the face of scarcity, we now pivot back to the realm of laws. You see, the medieval world was a place riddled with peculiar laws that weren't just limited to animal trials or debt punishments. They permeated every nook and cranny of life, including unexpected aspects like how you behaved in public or even what you wore. It was like discovering a new clause in the terms of service every single day, one that you implicitly agreed to just by being born. Imagine the laws concerning dress and attire. In many parts of the Middle Ages, there were sumptuary laws that dictated what different social classes were permitted to wear.
These laws were designed to maintain social order and ensure that the nobility could be easily distinguished from the peasantry. For instance, a peasant might be forbidden from wearing certain fabrics like silk or velvet, or from vibrant colors reserved for the aristocracy. Can you imagine wanting to wear a brilliant red cloak, but the law says, "No, sorry, that color is strictly for dukes"? Sounds like a fashion debate you couldn't win. These laws weren't just about style. They were about reinforcing the social hierarchy. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these laws helped maintain a clear distinction between the haves and the have-nots. It was like a visual reminder of your place in the world, and violating it could lead to punishment. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this was another way to control people, but in a slightly less messy way. In addition, there were laws governing public behavior. For instance, gambling was often prohibited or strictly regulated, and those caught engaging in it could face penalties. Excessive noise or disruptive behavior in public spaces could also lead to punishment. This demonstrated a desire to maintain an orderly society, even if it meant imposing restrictions on personal freedoms. Can you imagine trying to throw a rowdy party in the Middle Ages? You'd probably have an uninvited guest in the form of a law enforcer. A lesser-known aspect of medieval law concerned the regulation of gambling. While often outright forbidden, gambling remained a common pastime. Punishments could be severe, including fines, imprisonment, and even mutilation. This law reflected society's concern with morality and order, as well as a desire to prevent socially disruptive behavior. These laws, peculiar as they may seem by modern standards, served a vital purpose in medieval society. They helped to maintain order, reinforced social hierarchies, and expressed the moral values of the community. In a world without modern police forces or strong centralized law enforcement, the enforcement of these laws often relied on communal oversight and public shaming. In summary, the peculiar laws of the Middle Ages, from what you wore to how you behaved in public, were all threads in the complex tapestry of a society trying to maintain order and stability. They give us a fascinating insight into a world where every aspect of life was governed by a set of rules that might surprise us, but to them made perfect sense. Allow these thoughts of dress codes and public conduct to gently lull you to sleep as we prepare for the next segment of our historical exploration.
As we continue our journey through the peculiar laws of the Middle Ages, let's shift our gaze to another area that often surprises us today: marriage laws. While we have notions of love, consent, and individual choice, medieval marriage was often a complex blend of affection, politics, and legal maneuvering. It was like an arranged marriage, but with a few extra surprise clauses and a couple of legal hoops you didn't expect. Marriage was not merely a matter of the heart. It was a legal and social transaction with far-reaching consequences. It could merge estates, solidify political alliances, and ensure the inheritance of land and titles. Consequently, the laws surrounding marriage were incredibly intricate, sometimes leading to situations that seem unbelievable. Can you imagine trying to get married, but first you have to figure out if you're too closely related to your intended? One of the most complex aspects was the laws of consanguinity. The Church had strict rules about who could marry whom, prohibiting unions between people who were too closely related by blood. This included distant cousins you might not even realize were connected. Violating these laws could lead to the annulment of the marriage and the children being declared illegitimate, with dire consequences for inheritance. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that this led to some very convoluted family trees and a few embarrassing annulments. Perhaps that's why people didn't have many family reunions back then. Interestingly, those who wished to marry might need to obtain a dispensation from the church if they were related within the prohibited degrees. This often involved paying a fee and undergoing a thorough examination. For the wealthy, this was a minor inconvenience. For the poor, it could be an insurmountable barrier to a legitimate marriage. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this seems like another kind of hidden fee, but in this case, it could affect your soul. In addition, there were laws concerning the age of marriage and consent. While the age of marriage could be low by modern standards, often 12 for girls and 14 for boys, the consent of both parties was technically required for the marriage to be valid. However, in practice, this was often overshadowed by the will of parents or guardians, especially among the nobility. A marriage could be arranged in infancy to secure political alliances or property, with the actual consent of the bride and groom being a mere formality. A lesser-known twist was the concept of clandestine marriages. Although the church required marriages to be publicly proclaimed, secret marriages still occurred. These unions, while illicit, could still be considered religiously valid if there was an exchange of vows before two witnesses. This created a legal loophole where a marriage might be valid in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the law, leading to complex disputes over inheritance and rights. In summary, medieval marriage laws were a testament to the complexities of society during that era. They show a world where love was inextricably intertwined with politics, property, and the dictates of the church. Whether it was navigating the rules of consanguinity or struggling to obtain a dispensation, getting married in the Middle Ages was a legal and social endeavor far removed from what we know today. Allow these thoughts of complex unions and the struggle to merge families to gently lull you to sleep as we move on to the next segment of our historical journey. Moving on from the intricate rules of medieval marriage, let's turn to another area of law that often provides a different kind of insight into society: laws concerning minor offenses and public order. While we might focus on major crimes, the Middle Ages had a myriad of smaller rules aimed at maintaining peace and decorum within their tightly knit communities. It was like a school rule book, but if violating it could lead to being put in the stocks. Imagine the laws concerning drinking and public intoxication. While ales and wine were essential parts of the medieval diet, excessive drunkenness and disorderly conduct were often punished. A boisterous drunkard might face a fine, a stint in the town stocks, or even be forced to wear a drunkard's cloak, a barrel-like device that encased their body and head, exposing them to public humiliation. Can you imagine going out for a night on the town and ending up in one of those? Oh, look, there's Bob. He's having another wild night. These laws weren't just about punishment. They were about maintaining an orderly society and curbing disruptive behavior. In a world without modern police forces to patrol the streets, public shame and visible penalties were thought to be effective deterrents. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these laws probably made some people think twice before having that fifth pint. In addition, there were laws related to noise and nuisance. Excessive noise at night, or individuals causing general disruption to the peace of the community, could be fined or face other penalties. This showed society's desire to maintain a peaceful and respectful communal life. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, this seems like another kind of sunscreen, but for your ears. A lesser-known point was the laws concerning dogs and other domestic animals. Dogs running loose could be impounded, and their owners would have to pay to reclaim them, or they might even be killed. This was to prevent dogs from posing a danger to people or causing disruption to order. Sounds like a medieval version of animal control making a house call. In summary, Medieval laws concerning minor offenses and public order offer a fascinating glimpse into the priorities of a society grappling to maintain order in a world rife with potential chaos. Whether it was curbing public drunkenness or controlling noise, these laws attempted to create a harmonious and safe living environment for their communities. As we ponder these peculiarities, you might find that they are not merely humorous anecdotes. They are windows into a world where notions of order and control were vastly different from what we take for granted today. Allow these thoughts of shamed drunkards and errant dogs to gently lull you to sleep as we prepare for the next segment of our historical journey.
Having explored the rules of morality and gender, let's turn to another area of medieval law that often provided a starker insight into society: laws concerning sex and morality. Having explored the rules of morality and gender, let's turn to another area of medieval law that often revealed even deeper societal values and prejudices: laws concerning marginalized groups. In a society where status and community were paramount, certain groups of people found themselves excluded from certain rights and privileges, often bound by unique and often unjust laws. It was like having one set of rules for everybody, and then another, harsher set of rules just for some. Imagine the laws concerning Jewish people. During the Middle Ages, Jewish communities in Europe often faced widespread discrimination and marginalization. They were frequently barred from owning land, engaging in certain artisan guilds, or holding public office. This pushed many Jewish people into professions like moneylending, a practice forbidden to Christians by the Church, yet essential for the economy. However, even in this role, they were often subject to harsh laws, including heavy taxation and vulnerability to expulsion or persecution. Can you imagine being forced into a specific job, but then being penalized for doing it? These laws weren't just about difference. They were about imposing a rigid social hierarchy and reinforcing religious prejudices. Jewish people were often forced to live in separate areas of cities, known as ghettos, and might be required to wear special clothing or badges for easy identification. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these laws caused a great deal of suffering and created deep divisions within society. In addition, there were laws concerning those deemed heretics or who practiced different faiths. The church and secular rulers enforced a strict adherence to religious dogma, and those who were perceived to deviate from orthodoxy could face severe persecution. This could include punishments ranging from fines and imprisonment to torture and public execution. Sounds a bit like a witch hunt, but based on your beliefs. A lesser-known point was the laws concerning the disabled or beggars. While acts of charity and communal support existed, disabled people and beggars were often regulated by laws aimed at controlling their presence in public spaces. Some towns might prohibit begging altogether, while others regulated it, requiring beggars to have licenses or only allowing them to operate in specific areas. This reflected an effort to maintain order and control over groups perceived to be at the fringes of society. In summary, medieval laws concerning marginalized groups offer a grim insight into the social priorities and deep-seated prejudices of the era. They show a world where status, religion, and adherence to social norms could dictate one's rights and freedoms. As we ponder these laws, you might find that they are not merely historical curiosities. They are windows into a world where notions of equality, tolerance, and human rights were vastly different from what we take for granted today. Allow these thoughts of exclusion and the struggle for acceptance to gently lull you to sleep as we prepare for the final segment of our historical journey.
Having journeyed through the most peculiar laws of the Middle Ages, from animal trials to stringent moral codes, it's time to reflect on their legacy. While these laws might seem alien and even irrational to us today, they were not mere humorous anecdotes from a distant past. On the contrary, they are vivid windows into a world where concepts of justice, order, and society were profoundly different, and where the challenges of daily life shaped unique legal responses. The strangeness of medieval laws often concealed an underlying logic shaped by deep beliefs in divine intervention, the need to maintain social order, and the absence of modern institutions. The trials of animals and inanimate objects were not acts of madness. They were serious attempts to restore a cosmic balance that medieval people believed had been disrupted. Ordeals by God, though brutal, were a means of seeking divine truth when tangible evidence was scarce. Remember the crocodile poop sunscreen? Well, that was an example of a medieval problem being solved by medieval means. Laws concerning professions, debt, and market regulation all reflected a society grappling to maintain order in a challenging environment. From outlawed executioners to publicly shamed bakers for underweight bread, these laws were designed to shape behavior, deter crime, and reinforce social structures. Historians still debate, but the internet and tea houses have confirmed that these public deterrents could be far more effective than simply fining someone. The legacy of these laws lies not just in their bizarre nature, but in how they show us the evolution of justice. As societies evolved, so too did our understanding of reason, evidence, and human rights. The legal experiments of the Middle Ages laid the groundwork, however inadvertently, for the complex systems we have today. From recognizing the right to legal representation, even for donkeys, to seeking fairer means of dispute resolution, each step, no matter how small and winding, was a step forward. Furthermore, these peculiar laws remind us of the importance of contextualizing history. It's easy to dismiss medieval practices as primitive or barbaric, but to do so is to miss the ingenuity and purpose of the people who created and enforced them. To them, these laws were rational and necessary solutions to the problems they faced. We may not wish to live under such laws, but we can learn from them about human adaptability and the complex ways societies organize themselves. Ultimately, the story of medieval peculiar laws is a reminder that justice is not a static concept. It is constantly evolving, shaped by and shaping the values, beliefs, and technologies of its time. As we continued to build our own legal systems, we can look back on this history and draw lessons about the importance of fairness, the necessity of adaptation, and the unforeseen consequences of legal choices. As you drift to sleep tonight, let the images of peculiar trials, harsh punishments, and the deep beliefs that shaped the Middle Ages gently drift through your mind. Remember that even in the strangest of things, there are profound lessons waiting to be discovered. Take a deep breath, feel the comfort of your bed, and let the thoughts of a tumultuous past slowly fade. As the last candlelight of tonight's tale flickers, let us pause to reflect on the extraordinary journey we have taken through the peculiar laws of medieval Europe. We've witnessed trials of accused animals, ordeals by God that determined fate, and strange market regulations. We've explored the intricate rules of marriage and morality, and the unjust strictures faced by marginalized groups. These laws, though alien to modern sensibilities, were profound attempts to maintain order, reinforce religious belief, and shape behavior in a society vastly different from our own. From the public shaming of debtors to the harsh realities of food adulteration, each rule reflected a world where survival hinged on adherence to communal norms and divine intervention. While we have progressed immensely in our legal systems, these bizarre chapters of history remind us of human adaptability, the continuous evolution of justice, and the profound lessons the past can still offer. Let the tranquility of the night envelop you as you carry these reflections of a bygone era where oddity and justice often walked hand in hand.